Thank you very much for having me here. I'd first like to pass on the regrets for my boss, Jeanette Steffler, who's in the program. She unfortunately couldn't make it today. Personally, I'm very grateful for the opportunity to be able to come out here today, see some familiar faces and meet some new ones, and let you know a bit about our work. So I work with Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, the Strategic Research and Statistics Directorate. This is a project that we've actually been doing for, oh goodness, well over 10 years, I think. This is the Community Wellbeing Index. It's an index based at the community level that we've been putting together using the census and national household survey data for several cycles. We will be starting it again this year to produce data for the 2016 census cycle. So just an overview, we'll talk about what is the Community Wellbeing Index. We'll give an overview of results that we see not just for 2011, but we have a time scale of 30 years going back to the 1981 census. And there will be some information there on the methodology. I won't go too much into that, but it'll be a part of the presentation, and the actual data, the data set itself, is on our website, and you'd have access to that. And yeah, actually, well, I can get to that in a second. I can talk a bit more about the data. So why do a CWB? What is the CWB? The idea of the Community Wellbeing Index is to be a tool to be able to look in general at a spectrum of socioeconomic indicators for Canadian communities. So it's designed to be a reliable measure over time that provides useful and relevant information on communities, particularly for our purposes, First Nations, Inuit, and then non-Indigenous communities. And so I'll just sort of underline right here, all of the data we have is done at the community level, meaning the community is defined as being First Nations. Obviously that means reserve, but also other First Nations communities. Inuit communities, we were talking about Nunavik this morning, but from the 4 regions of Inuit Nunangat, there are 50 communities, and all other communities are considered non-Indigenous. So when you look at the data we have, it's for everyone living in that community. There are non-Indigenous people living in these Indigenous communities. There are Indigenous people living in non-Indigenous communities. We do look at that in further research. You know, I could come back and talk about that sometime, but this will be just the community level indicator. So the CWB is a score between 0 and 100. So the higher the number, the better the well-being, and it has 4 components, and there's actually 7 subcomponents. So you have education, and that's population having a high school diploma or higher, and the proportion that has a university degree. When we look at income, it's the total income per capita for the community. When we look at labor force, we have labor force activity and the proportion of the labor force that is employed. For those who are very familiar with Statistics Canada data, it is not the same as the employment rate. We can talk about that later too if people wish. The final one is housing, and we have sub-indicators of quantity and quality. Quantity meaning, do you live in a house that's crowded or not, defined by Statistics Canada as more than 1 person per room in the dwelling. Quality meaning, does your home need major repairs? And that's a self-report question on the census. So we put those 4 together into 1 score, so you get 1 CWB, but you can also break it down then. So what's the education score? What's the income score? What's the labor force? And we'll get to those results shortly. So, as I said, the purpose of the CWB is to provide a community level perspective. So the unit of analysis here is the community. This is a distribution graph showing First Nations, Inuit communities, and non-Indigenous. So First Nations are the yellow bars, or the gold bars. The red bars are the Inuit communities, and the non-Indigenous communities are the darker bars. So as you can see, there's a range of well-being for all communities in Canada. One of the things you will notice when you look at the bars for non-Indigenous communities, you have a much narrower range, and it tends to be up into the higher level. As you can see, these are the ranges of, and that's wrong, but that should be IBC, I believe. Sorry about that. But the so this is 100. Down below 20 is down there. So anything up on this end of the scale is obviously higher well-being. So as I was saying, non-Indigenous communities tend to be at the higher range, and they also have a narrower width. You can see for Inuit communities, there's a wider range between where most of the communities are in terms of higher scores and lower scores, and even more so with the First Nations community. So we see a much greater range of well-being, which was one of the reasons we did this. I'll actually just sort of as a bit of a sidebar here. The reason we did the Community Wellbeing Index, it actually came out of the Human Development Index by the UN. So for those that remember, the Prime Minister at the time, Jean Chrétien, he was very proud in the 90s to be able to say Canada's the greatest country in the world. It's the #1 country. And what he meant was we scored the highest on the Human Development Index. It was I believe it was Ovid Mercredi, the chief of the Assembly of First Nations at that time, who essentially said, well, that may be true for most of the country, but our communities are living in third world conditions. Some of the researchers, actually, I believe, between Western University and some folks at INAC said, well, let's actually try to measure that. Can we do a Human Development Index for First Nations? And they did. There was one done for registered Indians, one for non-registered, as well as for Inuit. And what it showed was that the Indigenous peoples of Canada were in where the range you'd call of medium Human Development Index. So it wasn't in the developing world, but it was definitely in a step below Canada and the rest of the developed world, whether it's the OECD or European countries or what have you. So the next response to that was, well, that's fair enough, but there's a huge variety of well-being that you see in our communities. Couldn't do the HDI at a community level for a variety of reasons, including the fact that it includes life expectancy. So we came up with this, the Community Wellbeing Index, and it does demonstrate, as you can see, there is this great range. There are a few communities, just a handful, but a few First Nations that are above the national average, and I'll show you the averages a little later. But as you can see, there are a great number that are well below. Now, I'm going to show some more time-scale data in a minute, but this, I just wanted to highlight what I would say is the biggest good news story of the Community Wellbeing Index is the number of communities that are at the extreme low end of the scale. And in general, we mean anything with a score below 50. Any community with a score below 50, think of it like a grade. If you're below 50, that's not good. And what we see, we're looking at First Nations here. In 1981, 62% were below 50. This has increased, so this is a graph showing the cumulative average here. And as you can see, in 2011, we only had 20%. So we see improvement, and I'll show you the average community well-being score in a moment. But we see improvement with community well-being scores over time. Most of that improvement comes from the fact that we have fewer and fewer communities at the lower end of the scale. One thing we don't see as much of is an increase of communities on the higher end of the scale. So we're seeing fewer poor performing communities. We're not seeing this additional number of exceptionally performing communities. Similar to First Nations, Inuit communities from 61% were below 50 in 81 to 2% in 2011, just one community. So now this is where we're going. Remember, I said the CWB is a community score. So these are now the average scores for the 3 types of communities in Canada. And in general, this gives you a sort of general picture. You can see here 79 out of 100 is the score for non-Indigenous communities. You have Inuit communities at 63, and you have a gap of 20 points for First Nations. So that's the biggest gap we see. When you look at the trend data, as I was saying, we see improvement over time. This is the good news story. We see, from 47 and 48. So you see a clear improvement over the last 30 years. But the same thing you see, a similar improvement for non-Indigenous communities. And what this means is the absolute well-being of these communities has improved, but the gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous has not decreased in 30 years. Now I'm going to just look a bit regionally, and this is, I think, a very important thing because we do a lot of research using the CWB to look at different characteristics. Is the community's remoteness related to their well-being score? Is the teenage fertility rate in a community related to a community well-being score? Is income inequality is another one. Is that related to the well-being score? And we see different results in different studies, but the one thing that we keep coming back to over and over again, the biggest driver of your community well-being score is the region you're in. And you can see right here, the prairies, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta are clearly the lowest scoring communities, followed by British Columbia, and you can see the rest of the country where they are in little more consistency in the 60s there. But now we have seen actually for the prairies for Saskatchewan and Alberta, for example, they've actually shown the greatest improvement between 2011 and 2006. When I say the greatest improvement, I'm talking 1 or 2 or 3 points, but they are still the lowest scoring regions there. So the region is a huge factor whenever we're doing any sort of analysis, and it always needs to be considered. Okay, so I'm going to go back to some time trend data now, and so as I said, we can break down the Community Wellbeing Index for the different components. So this is education. Again, you can see improvements, and I mean, these are dramatic improvements. I mean, look at First Nations from 14 up to 36. I mean, it's more than doubled in that time. But at the same time, we see this parallel improvement. So again, the gap is not increasing, or not decreasing, and in fact, it is increasing. I will point out, for those who may not be as familiar with the census data, Statistics Canada changed the concepts they use to measure education for the 2006 census. And so we kind of thought this jump may have been because of that. We don't know. I mean, this is speculation, but you can clearly see in the latest intercensal period between 06 and 2011, we see the same increase. So the trajectory of increase has clearly changed and gotten higher there, whereas for Indigenous communities, it's more or less going in the same direction. Income scores, this actually shows some interesting findings. If you just mentally remove the Inuit bar, you can see the same pattern. You know, there's no change in the gap for First Nations communities, despite the improvements we see over time. Looking at Inuit, on the other hand, you do see a clear closing of the gap. And in fact, if this were to continue, you know, I mean, you'd be pretty much closed within a census or two. There's a couple of factors to keep in mind with this. Number one, it has to do with what I mentioned before about non-Indigenous people living in Indigenous communities. There is a question, particularly in Nunavut, when the territory was created in 1999. One of the big changes was the clarity over, you know, development. You know, are people moving up north to sort of to work in the north, to do different things? So is there an effect there? We have done some work on that. The effect is modest. The other thing to remember when we're looking at this is the cost of living is so much higher in the north than it is in southern Canada. So even if in absolute dollars, and these are all comparable dollars, I can't remember what maybe they're 2001 or they're 2011 dollars, but they are all sort of matched using the Consumer Price Index. But you can still see, okay, the gap is narrowing. The income scores for Inuit are getting better, but that doesn't mean the same real buying power in Inuit communities. So a 77 in an Inuit community doesn't mean the same as a 77 would as far as your actual buying power in a southern community. So that has to be considered as well. Labor force activity. There's not much of a story to tell. The gaps are pretty much consistent, and in fact, we see the least amount of change over time for these indicators. Michael was referring to some data we see following the 2008 economic downturn and the effects that are more strongly felt for Indigenous communities. Clearly, you can see there's a little bit of a drop there for First Nations in the last year, and a slight decrease there for, well, 1 point. We don't really consider that too big of a change, but we still see a bit of indication there. On the whole, though, the gaps really haven't changed. There hasn't actually been a lot of movement in this particular category. The last one, I believe, is housing, and I have a little more to say on this one. So I'd mentioned before, I was talking about the Human Development Index. When the CWB was created, following on from the HDI, one of the things that was added was housing, and we did this because housing is a notable issue in First Nations and Inuit communities. And clearly you can see this. I mean, the issues with housing in the non-Indigenous population or non-Indigenous communities is very small. It's very consistent. There is, there are issues for a relatively small proportion, but well into the 90s is the score on housing for non-Indigenous communities. First Nations and Inuit communities, on the other hand, it's not the case. Very modest improvements here for First Nations over the 30 years. Inuit improvements, yes, but there was a bit of a change there. One of the things I do want to mention here, if you go back to the beginning of the presentation, this is made up of two separate factors, one of which is crowding, the other is state of repair in households. This is one of the cases where we actually do see a bit of a divergence from the two, and I don't believe I have the slides. Now, I don't have the slides here with me, but when you break down the two indicators, when you look at crowding, what you actually see in general for First Nations and Inuit is an improvement. So crowding is getting better over time. A bit flattening out over the last couple of years, but in general we see quite an improvement. In terms of the other one, quality, the time, sorry, I'm looking at that, the state of repair, sorry, what we see is actually a decrease. So it's actually going down over the last 30 years. So this relatively flat line actually masks two different things that we see, which is improvement in crowding and a decrease in the quality of housing. So those are the four components. I won't spend too much time here on this. This is simply a chart showing where the scores have gone from 1981 to the present. So green means things have gotten better, red means things have gotten worse. We have improvements in every component, even if it's only +1. We have improvements in every single component between 81 and 2011. But because we see improvements for non-Indigenous communities as well, you can see it's much more of a mixed bag here. So no change for a couple of them, and in some of them we see the gaps getting worse. I mean, in education, I mean, it's gotten worse by 8 points. You can see some other ones there. So the main thing I'd like to say here, the values that we see for the CWB have been improving over 30 years, but we also see an improvement for non-Indigenous communities, and therefore we see no reduction of the gap. And this is a huge thing for policymakers. I can tell you that my bosses and my boss's bosses, the gap is the key. This is actually one of the Prime Minister's 3 big priority areas when it comes to Indigenous people, which is closing the socioeconomic gap. In order to close the socioeconomic gap, obviously Indigenous outcomes need to be improving at a faster rate than non-Indigenous ones. And of course, nobody has any control over the non-Indigenous outcomes. No one's trying to slow those down. So, the issue is how to make those other improvements happen faster. It's a difficult one to say, and I don't really know what the answer is, but clearly you can see that there's still a lot of work to be done. I'm going to just talk a bit here finally about the information. So the website is there to get all of the data from the CWB. The data is on, you can also get it through the Open Data Portal, the government sort of open data initiative, but the data set for 2011 is here. Actually, I believe they're all on there now from I think from 81 to 2011, you can get the data here. If you want the data in greater detail than is publicly available on the website, you can contact us. This is the email here, INSTAT. This is the statistical response group. We are actually working with the RDC to try to get the CWB put into the research data center. One of the issues, of course, is for small communities, we can't actually take the data out from the RDC. So if you go into the RDC, you get the full, unrounded, unsuppressed data set that you can do these national sort of analyses on. The data we get, there are limits to in terms of response rates and community size. Any other general questions that aren't directly related to, just saying you want data? This is where to go for that. Any general questions on the Community Wellbeing Index or any of the research we do can be sent to the following research website. I should have my own personal email here, but I'm sure you can contact me through Simona. So I'm happy to take any questions. I should also apologize now because I do have to leave as soon as I'm done here, but I'm not running away. I will always be available for more questions. So thank you very much. Merci.